Climate now represents the largest position in our funds today. So roughly just under 20% of exposure is focused on climate stocks. And the thing that we noticed through 2020, or the thing that I think surprised us a little bit, was that even though the pandemic raged through the planet and obviously dominated the headlines everywhere, it was followed up by a similar epidemic of sorts of companies, countries, councils all announcing zero carbon targets by 2050. So during the year, we've seen every single country in Europe effectively commit to zero carbon by 2050. We've seen the Chinese commit to zero carbon by 2050. And obviously we've now seen Joe Biden as US president, who's clearly going to focus on this into the future. On top of that, corporates all over the world have been signing up to it, as too have states and councils. And so this epidemic of sorts is effectively going to be very, very expensive. And so from our point of view, when we look at the climate goals that are being announced, and we look at the costs that could be required to achieve them, we get well over $20 trillion has to be spent here in a period of time between 2020 and 2050, when all of these countries are effectively going to be zero carbon. And when they say zero carbon, they don't mean emitting no more carbon, they're emitting no carbon. And what we're trying to show you here on the pie is where we think that money will be spent. There are a range of different industries. It's not just renewable energy. It's not just electric vehicles. There's a range of different areas and beneficiaries. And from that point of view, our job here at Munro is to follow the money and to find the companies that we think that can benefit this in the months and years ahead. And I think the other overwhelming thing to notice here is that there isn't just a political will to do this. There is actually an economic argument to doing it. Renewable energy in particular now is cheap enough to really compete with fossil fuel. And so from that point of view, the switch is quite logical. It's got power, and we think it will happen over a long period of time. And the more we look at this opportunity, I think the thing that comes through is how early we are in this adoption. And so we often talk about S-curves here at Munro's. The climate S-curve is right at the start, whether we're looking at wind power in terms of onshore wind, which has really been around for a long time, but if you look at the targets that are required, has quite simply decades of growth ahead of it. And then when you look at offshore wind next to it, is really just at the beginning of that cycle. And if we move it on to battery technology, it's important to stress that most renewable energy facilities will need a big battery alongside them to make them efficient. Or if we just look at electric vehicles, we are still very much at the early part of these S-curves. And so what the market is going to do here is it's going to see that this growth is very long and continuous and sustainable, and it's going to try and price a lot of it in today. And so what happened through 2020 is we just got a lot of clarity around these growth runways, and so hence a lot of clarity for these growth winners. And so we now drill down to some of these growth winners. They do effectively run across some of these same areas. And so what we're showing you here is Ørsted. It's one of our largest climate holdings. It is the world's largest offshore wind developer. It's listed in Denmark. It has a market cap of over $100 billion today, and ultimately has this very strong lead in offshore wind. And so from that point of view, we see quite simply decades of growth ahead for this company. There is obviously going to be competition, but their experience in developing these areas makes them the developer of choice. And so to give you a good example, when Taiwan Semiconductor wants to make its production in Taiwan carbon neutral, it talks to Ørsted to help it develop the largest offshore wind farm in Taiwan. And that decades of growth we don't think is adequately priced into the stock. And even if it was today, just following time will ultimately see this stock perform well. Other areas we really like are batteries. Here we've chosen to invest in Samsung SDI. Samsung SDI is listed in Korea, is a large contract battery manufacturer. And effectively they make batteries for everything, whether they go in your mobile phone, into your computer, into your electric scooter, or into your car. But the really big opportunity we see for Samsung SDI is they are the #1 leader in these very large grid battery, or these large energy storage batteries. If we think about these renewable facilities around the world, all of them will perform better with a large grid-style manufacturing battery that we're showing you here in the picture. And so from that point of view, when you think about it, it doesn't blow the wind all the time. The big problems renewables have is they don't compete with baseload because it's not always windy. But if you stick a battery on the site, then ultimately that power becomes more consistent, and ultimately renewables can become a larger and larger part of the baseload. Samsung SDI we see as the key winner here, and we see significant upside ahead. This company is well below 100 billion in market cap today. The second last idea we wanted to flag here is listed in Holland. Its name is Alphan. This is just a €2 billion company today. also sits within our funds. Alphan is effectively the company that helps you fix the grid. So as renewable shift happens, the grid effectively has to change because you have different sources of power coming from different areas, very similar to what I discussed about renewable facilities. They need to upgrade the grid. We need to upgrade charging points. They're the largest charging point manufacturer in Europe also. This tiny company is emerging very strongly in Europe, and we see it as a very long-term winner. Expensive today, but people are underestimating how long their growth rate run is and how long it could go for. And I suppose the last slide here we wanted to flag to you is to try and frame the upside we see from client is really Tesla. So Tesla is the story of 2020. What a huge performance it generated. It pulled forward a lot of obviously the demand that it's going to see into the future. And this is actually an update of a slide that we showed last year. And what we tried to show you with Tesla last year is we tried to say, you've got to think about Tesla a bit like Apple. Tesla's coming along and it's disrupting the car market in the same way Apple disrupted the mobile phone market. And when Apple came along, the mobile phone market was roughly $500 billion. And at the time when we first invested in Apple, we thought Apple would effectively take a share of that mobile phone market. And what ended up happening is it took a lion's share of that mobile phone market and then went beyond that with all these other services and all these other ways of making money. And so ultimately Apple's market cap now is nearly 2.5 times the size of the entire mobile phone market. The car market is 5 times the size of the mobile phone market. It's a $2.5 trillion market. Tesla is clearly also disrupting it with a new product. It's seen huge performance in the last 12 months, 50 billion to 700 billion. So clearly it's pulled a lot of that demand forward and it's probably a bit ahead of itself at the moment. But if you look at the opportunity on a much longer term time horizon, there is still potential upside here. There is still potential upside should they execute against becoming the dominant electric car producer and also all the services that they could put on top of that. And that's something that we'll definitely be following here at Munro into the future. And I think the final point we'd leave you with on climate is this is really the next big S-curve. This will run over 20 years. Yes, the stocks will get ahead of themselves. Yes, they might get overvalued, but the opportunity will be there. And we intend to be there over that time frame to make sure that we can monetize this great energy transition.